Mr. Morita. Mr. Reagan, so is Winrick, Mr. Kingston. Let's see if he comes. All right, good to see you all again. Continuing on with honoring Hispanic Heritage Month. We're going to talk about this gentleman on his way to sainthood, Father Felix Varela y Morales. Felix Varela is his name down here. Varela y Morales. When did he live? Let's see. He was born in 1788 in Havana, Cuba. 1788. He died in 1853. 1853. Clearly you can see he was a priest. We'll get to that in a moment. Anyways, yes. Oh, charging, okay. As I said, he was born in Cuba, which was part of the Spanish Empire, not part of America. So how did he get to be, how can I call him an American? Well, we'll get to that. And he had a kind of an eventful life. He moved around a bit. He moved for a brief time when he was a kid, he moved from Cuba to Florida, which at the time was under Spanish control until we invaded it. And I think it was Andrew Jackson, one of our presidents, killed the Spanish governor and took over Florida for us. That's how we got Florida, anyways. So he was living there in Florida for a while, and then he went back to Cuba, where he felt the call to the priesthood, and so he studied to become a priest, which he apparently did, and I did not. And I guess he knew other stuff because he taught at the seminary for a while. He taught philosophy, he taught physics, he taught chemistry, so I guess he had some scientific training as well in his background. And so he's very influential, he became influential or notable, not just here in the United States eventually, but in Cuba. While he was in Cuba, as I said, Cuba was under the control of the Spanish. And so he worked for independence for Cuba, to be independent of the Spanish Empire. He also worked for the abolition of slavery in the Spanish Empire, or at least in Cuba. You have to remember, like, during history, at this time in history, in the 1800s, there was a large independence movement that went on throughout Central and South America, with many parts of the Spanish Empire claiming their independence. And he wanted Cuba to be independent, which didn't necessarily endear him to the people in authority. And eventually he went over to... Did he go to Spain? Or was he still in Cuba? Well, anyways, I think he went to Spain at one point, where his views got him into trouble, and he was actually sentenced to death by the government. So he was supposed to be executed for his views, and he fled, however, and that's when he made his way to the United States. He made his way to New York City, where he settled and began serving in the Diocese of New York City as a priest. He founded a newspaper, which was the first Spanish-language newspaper in the United States, in the country. I don't know if it still exists, but he founded it for a Spanish-language one. And he worked amongst the Spanish-speaking community that was there. Who knows how big it was at the time in New York City? I wonder how big it was. But anyways, he worked amongst the Spanish-speaking community, and he also moved his way up the ladder within the Diocese of New York. And also northern New Jersey. He ministered in northern New Jersey. Eventually, he retired, and he had developed severe asthma, and I guess that's what he died from, but that's just a detail. But he died a natural death. And obviously, he was recognized as a holy man, or a good man, because they opened his cause for canonization. He's at the second level. He is Father Venerable Felix Morales And so that's, I guess, an accurate picture of him, what he actually looked like. And I ask for your prayers, Father Felix, to Christ our God. Amen. So, Father Felix Varela, Venerable. I'd like to look at the textbook for a moment. One of our textbooks, actually, the one by Stephen Binns. You see that? Is anybody? Hi, Mr. O'Neill's here. So, Kazin and Wenrick. All right. God bless you, Mr. Kettner. God bless you, Ms. Donnelly. Let's see who else is you right. Belton. Belts. Sorry. Is it okay? Yes. Yes. Huh? Well, that's good. Okay, so that's very positive. I appreciate it. Just looking. Okay. Anyways, well, I wanted to just talk about it briefly in a way because it was part of your readings and the readings show up on the quiz. But there were some mistakes in the book when I was doing my readings that I just wanted to point out. In chapter 3, I didn't see anything here. It's chapter 4. Oh, yes, that's a mistake. I didn't make a note of that. In chapter 3, when he's talking about dynamic equivalence, this is on page 21. It's page 21. He mentions the Jerusalem Bible, okay? And he says the Jerusalem Bible was the first Catholic translation in English to be made directly from the biblical languages, meaning Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, instead of from the Latin Bible. Okay, before that, previously, the standard for translations into any language for Catholics was based on the Latin version of the Bible, which was okay, you know. But they wanted to switch it to going to the original languages, which the Latin is based on. But that's actually not a correct statement. We said it was the first Catholic translation into English to be made directly from the biblical languages. No, the Jerusalem Bible was not. The Bible de Jérusalem was, when it was in French, yes. But the Jerusalem Bible is a translation of the French version. There were a bunch of French scholars, Dominican scholars, members of a religious order called the Order of Preachers, founded by St. Dominic Guzman, hence called the Dominicans, who I believe were stationed in Israel, Palestine at the time. And they did a translation, very good translation, into French from the original languages. The people who did the Jerusalem Bible in English did not do that. They just translated from the French into English. So it's Jerusalem Bible is a translation of a translation. Okay? I remember that because when I was in seminary and graduate school, you know, like my Bible professors would be all hepped up about the Jerusalem Bible. They love the Jerusalem Bible. And I always say, but wait a second, I thought we had to go to the original sources, and they based it on the French. They didn't even translate it themselves. But what the Bible scholars like about the Jerusalem Bible is that the footnotes are really good, and they are really good. They're very detailed and very interesting. But the translation itself sucks. It just sucks, not just as an English translation, because it's also the weird stuff. He said they're dynamic equivalents, so they kind of got the sense. They had all these there's a lot of weirdness to the Jerusalem Bible translation. So it sucked as a translation, but it also wasn't a direct translation from the biblical languages. So Binns is actually incorrect on that. Oh yeah, and he doesn't like red letter Bibles. Well, poo-poo on you. I love red letter Bibles. Where they have the words of Jesus in red letters, because that's sometimes the only way I can find stuff. It makes it so easy to find something Jesus said, because you look for the red letters. Ooh, we're not supposed to have red letter in me. Poop on you, Binns. Anyways, chapter 4, he talks about how we got chapters in the Bible, because I showed you a picture, I think, of a manuscript, and I showed you just saw the columns of text, right? There were no chapters or verses or anything. Just how they punctuation, that's just how they wrote. But eventually in the Middle Ages, they did, Christians added chapters, and he says it's by Stephen Langton, which is true. He added chapters to the Bible, not verses, but he did add chapters, chapter sections. But he makes a mistake. Binns makes a mistake when he says that he was the chancellor of the University of Paris. Langton was never the chancellor of the University of Paris. He went to the University of Paris. I think he lectured there as a teacher. He was never the chancellor of the University of Paris. He later left Paris and became the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. So that's a mistake by Binns in the book. Oh, I'm sorry. This is page 26. I apologize. Page 26 at the bottom. He says, our present system of dividing the Bible into chapters was invented in the 13th century, actually around 1227, by the Chancellor of the University of Paris, Stephen Langton. Okay, this system began to be used in many manuscripts of the entire Latin Bible and then was used by the Jewish scholar. No, that's not true. He was not the Chancellor of the University of Paris at any point in time, because we know who the chancellors were, and I checked the names, and his name is not there. And then verses come later. Robert Estienne is correct, is a Protestant scholar, apparently, who added verses to the New Testament, and then somewhere along the way, someone added verses to the Old Testament. Okay, so those are just a couple of things I wanted to mention in the book. Not many other mistakes that I would say in the book. The book is pretty solid, generally. But those are a couple of things, or a few things that I just wanted to point out because they were definitely not true. They were inaccurate. And some of his quotations are a little off, actually, because I had to email him and ask him about one of his quotations from, I think, Pope Pius XII. I'm like, where is that in the document? I can't, And he couldn't find it either. So he was kind of remembering. It happens. Okay. Bible. Sacred writing. Let's see, where do we stop? Old Testament, New Testament. Okay, so we have two canons in the Scripture, two canons in the Christian sacred writings. And we have to remember something. And maybe I'll come back to this, because I should get to this first. Yeah, I think that's more logical if I go there first. All right, I'll go to the next slide. What are the divisions of these canons? Let me get to the specifics first, and I'll come back to canon later in the authoritative writings. The two sets. First, we start with the Old Testament. And this is the Christian division of the Jewish writings. Although I'm reminded recently that, from another thing I read, that the New Testament is also a set of Jewish writings, because they're all Jews. But these are, for lack of a better term, okay? Just understand that. Jesus was a Jew, the early apostles, the writers of the New Testament were probably also Jewish. So the New Testament is also Jewish. So I could call them Jewish writings. But I'll reserve Jewish writings for what modern Jews in Judaism, who are not Christians, would accept as sacred writings. They would not accept the New Testament. They would accept what we call the Old Testament. And the Old Testament, at least from the Christian perspective, is divided up into 4 sections. Okay, the Pentateuch, number 1, the historical books, the wisdom books, and then finally the prophetic books. Okay, Pentateuch, history, wisdom, prophets is the fourfold division. Okay. This is the Christian division. Yeah, I'll do that. The Pentateuch comes from two Greek words, pente, which means 5, and teuchos, which means a volume. Okay, so the 5 volumes, the 5 books, you could say, but literally 5 volumes. The Pentateuch is what it's called. In general, it's called the Law of Moses. Okay, the books of the Law of Moses. And it's called that even because most of it does comprise laws that were given to this man Moses and then given to the Jewish people. The Pentateuch, the 5 volumes, what are they? They're the first 5 books of the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these books, Exodus and Deuteronomy, comprise the law. So that's the law of Moses. So you can see most of the focus is on law in the Pentateuch. Genesis is not so focused. Genesis is more, as the word kind of says to you with the word gene in it, it's about origins. Like, where did the Jews come from? What are their origins? What are their father figures? Okay, and also the origins of everything, the creation story about the world and stuff like that. So the Pentateuch, those are the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Then you have what are called the historical books that are properly, historical. They seem to describe history. And actually, let me put that down there. Oh, I wish I had done that. Oh, I wanted to do that. Okay. The historical books, so if you're looking at your NAB and you go to the table of contents, and the historical books, so like the book of Joshua, the books of Samuel, the books of Kings, which talk about David the king and the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, and stuff like that. So they seem to be properly dealing with historical events. So that's why they're put there. Also, books like Tobit. Now, you see it in your table of contents where they say biblical novellas. I don't know where they're getting that from. I kind of know where they're getting it from. But there's no such thing as biblical novellas. A novella is a book that's not long enough to be a novel, but it's longer than a short story. It's like in between a short story and a full-length novel. So they call it a novella, a little novel. These are not historically placed in novellas. They are placed part of Tobit, Judith, Esther, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are placed in the historical books traditionally. This is just a new category that they just did for the NAB. I've checked other Bible translations. They don't follow the NAB on this, and nor do the commentaries. So ignore it. I'm not going to ask you about it, and I don't think you should know it, because I think, frankly, that the NAB people are just being a little bit clever and making something up that they want. Because they're not, what makes them novellas? Because there are other books in the Old Testament that could just as well be longer short stories and not long novels. Why these books? Anyways, so you see the historical books. They tell the history of Israel specifically, and God bless you, mostly in the historical books they're focused on King David and the kingdom of Israel, the united kingdom of Israel under David, is what a lot of the historical books are focused on. Then you've got wisdom books. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is simply knowledge. From Old English, witan, to know something. Knowledge. Specialized and profound knowledge of ethical and practical things. Deals with human flourishing, usually wisdom literature. Nothing unique about the Jews with wisdom literature. You find this in other cultures as well, where you have people who write stuff where they give you advice about what leads to a full human life. They're giving you knowledge about how to live a full human life. It's called wisdom literature. And the Jews developed their own wisdom literature. Okay, so wisdom, specialized and profound knowledge, ethical and practical pursuit of human flourishing, what you need to know to live a good life. And this includes books, as you can see here, like Job, which talks about the question of evil. Why do good people suffering? The Psalms, which are put in the wisdom literature, but are really songs. Proverbs, maxims, little short pithy sayings, that's obvious. The book of Ecclesiastes, which asks what's the best way to live life. Song of Songs, which is about sex. Book of Wisdom, and it's right there in the title, the Book of Wisdom, The Wisdom of Solomon also. The Wisdom of Ben Sira, again, it's in the very title, the Wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, okay? So we have the wisdom books as the third section of the Old Testament canon for Christians. And then finally we have the prophetic books, and a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God, speaks for God. in the name of God. Could be about things that are happening now, could be about things happening in the future. Most biblical scholars don't like the futuristic aspect of prophecy. They try to say prophets never predict the future, because that was kind of like the emphasis in the previous generations, that a prophet always predicted the future. It goes both ways, because I've read my Bible, and there are times when the prophets are talking about current events, and there are times when they're clearly talking about things that will happen in the future that they don't know about, but God does, and tells them what's going to happen. So, I can't deny what I've read, it's right there. Just because some biblical scholars think, well, you can't really predict the future, Okay, well, Prophet Isaiah thought he could. He does it. So prophecy, okay? And the word prophet in Hebrew, we'll come back to this, so I'll mention it here, is nabi, which is a hard word to pin down in Hebrew, but basically it means like someone who sees something. So a seer, a visionary, you could say. A nabi, okay? A seer. So that's what prophecy kind of is. You have visions of, God, what God's kind of like the prophet sees how God sees the world in a way, and interprets it and speaks about how God sees things that are going on in the world. Usually not good. Usually God is not happy. When a prophet shows up, Miss McGowan, it's usually not a good thing. He doesn't have a happy message. Yes, sir.
You consider a dream a prophecy?
Yeah, you can get prophecies through dreams. Yeah, that happens in the Bible. People have dreams of things that are going to happen, or might have, for example, I'm just trying to think of an example. The first, like Joseph, Jesus' father, has a dream where an angel appears in the dream and tells him to take the child and his mother and flee because this guy, King Herod's going to kill him. That's kind of like telling him the future. He's telling him what's going to be attempted. I'm trying to think in the Old Testament, because I know they have dreams in the Old Testament, but I forget. It doesn't pop into my head immediately.
Wasn't there one with for the Jacob ladder or something like that?
Oh, that's right. Yes, he has a dream and he sees a ladder going up to heaven with angels coming up and down. But it's not really about the future, though. I mean, he's just having a vision of heaven. And he recognizes that he's had a contact with the sacred, and I think he puts a rock there and pours oil over it and blesses it. So dreams can be prophetic. Okay. What am I talking about here? It's the Septuagint. Am I going to get to the Septuagint yet? Or am I moving on to the Septuagint? Yes, I am. Okay, so I'm not at the New Testament yet, but I do want to talk about this. For your knowledge, this is not on the PowerPoint. I'm writing it on the board. Jews, however, do not divide their scriptures this way. This is the Christian division of scripture. Pentateuch, history, wisdom, prophets. That's how Christians organize the books. The Jews do not organize the books that way. Okay? They actually have a threefold division of the Testament. This is all in agreement on this, Christians and Jews. The Pentateuch, but they don't call it Pentateuch. It's called Torah, or instruction. Torah, which in Hebrew means instruction. Instruction. And it's the same thing as the Pentateuch. It's the first five books of the Bible are called Torah. Torah. After that, it's different, okay? The next section, the second section of the Hebrew Bible, where do I want to put this? I guess I'll put it over here, is the prophets, actually, which is called Nevi'im. Nabi is a prophet, and the plural is Nevi'im, the prophets. The prophets. So everything that they consider the prophets, they just all group together. And they don't all agree with Christians as well. There's differences even there. For example, the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is considered a prophetical book by Christians, but not by Jews. The book of Daniel is not placed amongst the prophets. Okay? But except for that, I think that's the one difference. Except for the book of Daniel, and maybe is it also the book of Jonah? Well, I think the book of Jonah is also. Well, anyways, except for the book of Daniel, the prophets are pretty much the same as in the Christian Bible. Then there's a third section, because what do you do with all the other writings that aren't part of Torah, but aren't really prophets or prophetical? You know, the books that are history and poetry, kind of philosophy, wisdom, literature. Well, they just dump everything in this section called the writings, or ketuvim. Ketuv in Hebrew means writing. So this is the plural, ketuvim, the writings. So all the stuff that does not fit in the rabbi's view as Torah, or does not fit in as a prophetical writing, gets dumped into just, into the ketuvim, the writings in general. The scriptures, you could say, another way of describing. And that's how they divide their scriptures into these three sections. Now, I told you before that they don't call it the Bible. Jews love acronyms. You know what an acronym is? What's an acronym, Mr. Morita?
It's like those words for each other's name.
Yeah, like what? Give me an example. All right. Can someone give me an example of an acronym? He's right, but can someone give me an example of an acronym? Yes. Is it Kelby?
Like, that's for like a name count.
Okay. All right, let's see what.
Like if your name's Robert, some people call you Bob.
Bob? Okay, that's good. But that's more of a nickname, I think. Or something, maybe it's not a nickname, maybe there's another word for it. Not an acronym. No. But you're on there, okay, but you're thinking, which is good. But you're on the right track. Yes, don't tell me. I'm the gallon, sorry.
LOL, which stands for that.
Yeah, LOL. LOL will be an acronym for laugh the words laugh out loud. Or NASA. NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. Or the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Acronym. Okay, good. So you know what it means. The Jews love acronyms, which can make talking to Jews very difficult. Because they make everything into an acronym, and so it's like, what are you talking about? Unless you're raised Jewish, you don't know, and I wasn't raised Jewish. So because they make everything into an acronym. So what they do is they took the first letter of each section of their Bible, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So T and K, that's the acronym, and they add an A, the vowel A in between, so it's pronounceable. So you don't say tunk. It's not the tunk. It's the Tanakh. The Tanakh. So if you hear a Jew talking about the Tanakh, they're talking about what you would say is the Bible, or at least the Jewish version of the Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Tanakh. That's what they call it. As I said, they do this all over. They talk about not just acronyms, but also nicknames for stuff. They'll call books by the name of the rabbi who wrote it and stuff. So if you don't know the book, if you don't know who the rabbi is, then you don't know what they're talking about. And they call rabbis, they use acronyms for rabbis. So Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, very famous medieval rabbi, is called, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. So they call him Rashi. And they do this with like a lot of the rabbis. Rashi, Rashbam, Rambam, Ragbag, Rambanam, Ragbal. These are all different acronyms for these various rabbis that if you don't know, it's like, yeah.
Is a rabbi like a priest?
No. Nope. Not at all. A rabbi is a teacher. He is a teacher of the law. He's an expert in the Torah. Because the Jews still have priests, even though their temple was destroyed a long time ago. There are people who have, from their heredity, priesthood is hereditary. You inherit it from your father, who's a priest. And so, there's no temple, so they don't have any sacrifices they can do. But there are actually priests. People recognized as priests in the community, and they're able to give certain blessings during the synagogue service and do certain things that others can't do. But no, a rabbi just leads prayers and teaches about Torah. Actually, the rabbi doesn't necessarily even lead the prayers. And the chazan, the cantor, the singer. But but he certainly teaches about Torah. And anyways, if you ever meet a Jew named Cohen, then you know that he's a priest, because the word Kohen means priest in Hebrew. So Jews, and you can tell from the last name usually, Khan, Cohen, Cohen, I think other words like Levi, stuff like that, indicates they have a priestly lineage. So they have special duties within the synagogue. But there's no temple, so they don't do any of that anymore. Okay, so that's how the Jews divide up the Old Testament, their Old Testament, which they would not call the Old Testament. And the books are a little bit different, as I told you. The Torah is the same. The historical books are mostly the same, although they actually want to go online. I'm going to show you. Something good image here. What can we see? That's not a bad image, but this seems to be simpler. I like this. You like this? Here we go. You see that? Or is it too small? Is that better? Actually, it's, they have to do this, so you can't, so it cuts stuff off, All right, let's try this. Because they don't do that. No, have to deal with it. All right, so there's the Torah, the law, the prophets, the writings. You have like books like, I wanted to show you, books like this, like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, are historical books for Christians. As I told you, they mainly focus on King David and the kingdom of Israel. Joshua and Judges focus on the conquest of Canaan by the Jews. But they're put under prophetic books by the Jews. The Jews regard them as prophecies, not as histories. And then you have the true prophets named after Isaiah, Jeremiah. There are 12 minor prophets. They're lesser prophets just because their books are short, and they're all grouped into one book, the 12. So that, yeah, Jonah is here. But notice that Daniel is not. Daniel is not regarded as a prophet, even though the Christians would. And then the writings. You have poetry, what are called the 5 rolls, the 5 scrolls. Esther is considered history by Christians, so is Ruth. And Lamentations is put into prophecy by Christians because it's connected with the prophet Jeremiah. So it was placed after the prophet Jeremiah, the book of the prophet Jeremiah. So is Baruch. But the Jews don't accept Baruch. But they place Lamentations not in the prophets, but in the writings. And then you have Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles would also be considered historical books by Christians, but Jews consider them just simple writings. Oops, sorry. So, did you know, if you're Catholic, I know Catholics don't read the Bible, so you probably never heard of these books. I'm sorry, but I'm Catholic too, but I know my peeps. I love my peeps, but I know them. And maybe you haven't heard of these books if you're Catholic. I hope you have, because you might have noticed that, wait a second, wasn't there a book of Tobit? Wasn't there Maccabees that he mentioned? And where is that in the Tanakh? I didn't see that in the Tanakh. Okay? You have to remember that at the time of Jesus, the 1st century A.D., Anno Domini, okay, we'll come to this. Don't fret over it. We'll get to this in a moment. Just calm down. Just listen and take it in. At the time of Jesus, neither the Jewish canon nor what would come to be called the Christian canon of scriptures was complete or settled. Okay? Obviously, at the time of Jesus, there was no New Testament at all for Christians because, Mr. O'Neill, Jesus. You know, you have Jesus, so you don't need a New Testament. He's right there, okay? So there was no New Testament, and for a long, long time there was still no New Testament because things have to get written down eventually. All right, so there was no gospel. Oh, wait a second. So I showed you the period of time on a previous slide for the Christian writings, sometime between the 60s and the early 100s, maybe as late as the 120s, before we have a full New Testament, a full set of what you could call a Christian canon. And even then, the Christian canon, the authoritative list of writings for Christians, was not really truly settled, at least in the Western part of Christianity, until the 300s, the 4th century AD. So it took a time. Amongst Jews, at the time of Jesus, there also really wasn't any set canon. We could say that, and let me go back to this, the Pentateuch was pretty much set by the time of Jesus. The Torah, the 5 books of Torah, from what we know, that was accepted. That was settled. There was no question really about these 5 books. But everything else was up for grabs. Okay, some things were pretty easy, like some of the prophets and stuff like that. But other books were not so easy, and we know this because, the rabbi, in some of the discussions we have from the rabbis, supposedly from the time period and later, we know that there were questions and there were things that they were undecided on. Books like, for example, the book of Esther that I mentioned before. The book of Esther in Hebrew never mentions God at all. Not even apparently implicitly. It's just a story about this Jewish woman Esther and her attempt to save her people from annihilation. Nothing at all in Hebrew. And so the rabbis were disturbed by that. Should that be considered a sacred writing? How can it be sacred when it never mentions the divine name? Christians have no problem with that because some Jew later on translated Esther into Greek and added all sorts of references to God. And that's the book that actually Christians accept, or Catholics, I should say, and Eastern Orthodox accept. We don't accept the Hebrew one as inspired. It's the longer one. But the Jews do, and they have problems with that. Song of Songs, which is placed in the writings, it's all about sex. It's a celebration of sex between a man and his bride. Okay, God's not a swinger, Mr. Kettner. All right, God's not into polyamory and all that. All right, so let's be clear. Because I know this because you'll sometimes hear people on the internet talk about it and say it's just sex between anybody. It's just sex for sex, and that's beautiful. No, it's clearly these are songs being sung back and forth between a bride and his groom. Some scholars think the Song of Songs actually is that. It was a kind of liturgy, a kind of celebration, a marriage celebration that was written down and then found its way into the Bible. But it's very explicit about the sexual imagery. I mean, especially in the Hebrew and stuff, some of the words are very explicitly sexual, talking about the sexual organs and how beautiful sex between a man and a woman is. Well, that disturbed the rabbis. Should that belong? The book of Ecclesiastes, which we're not exactly sure how to translate that word. Sometimes it's translated the preacher, the assemblyman. Anyways, we don't know who wrote it. Traditionally Solomon the king, but probably not. The book of Ecclesiastes is a philosophical work dealing with the question of life. What's the meaning of life? But it's very pessimistic. And it gives all sorts of responses. Well, the meaning of life is to get a lot of money. Yeah, but you die and your money goes to other people. Okay, fine. Well, the meaning of life is to be wise, to get a lot of knowledge. Yeah, but you die and your wisdom goes nowhere. It's dead with you. Okay, well, the meaning of life is to serve God, to love God. And so, yeah, but, you live a good life, be a good person. Yeah, but both people who are righteous and those who aren't righteous both still die. And also you see righteous people suffer in their lives, whereas evil people sometimes prosper. So that answer doesn't work for Ecclesiastes. So it's a very pessimistic work. It also disturbed the rabbis, and they really were not sure it should be admitted. They had a lot of debate over it. So there was no closed group of writings for Christians to accept or simply adopt at the time of Jesus. And the New Testament itself reflects this unsettled condition, even in the New Testament. Why? How do we know this? Because the authors of the New Testament cite, quote, or allude to books that would later become non-canonical for Jews, that Jews would reject, that we'll talk about in a moment. You know, they allude to books like Tobit or Maccabees that later on Jews would not accept. But at the time of Jesus, some Jews did accept them as scripture. And they also cite books that never made it into the Christian canon, like, for example, a book called First Enoch, which is a series of visions by this man Enoch. He goes up to heaven and it's all these visions. And so it's First Enoch. Might have been written by a Christian. It was something called the Assumption of Moses. Moses is taken up into heaven, the body of Moses. So these, are cited, in fact, quoted in some of the New Testament writings by Christians, but they were not later accepted as scripture. And also in the New Testament, you find scriptures cited that have been lost, that we have no clue about. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, the second chapter, if you know the story, you know that, and I mentioned this before, Joseph has a dream where an angel tells him to take Jesus, the baby Jesus, and Mary, his mother, and to flee. They flee to Egypt because Herod the king wants to kill Jesus. He doesn't want the Messiah to challenge him as king. So they go to Egypt, and then eventually King Herod dies, and Joseph has another dream where an angel appears to him and says, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go back, because Herod is dead. You don't need to worry." And so Joseph goes back with Mary and Jesus, and on their way, they decide to go up north. They're not going to go back to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. They're going to go up north to this town called Nazareth to live. And so, verse 23 of chapter 2, Joseph went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. Quote, "He shall be called a Nazarene." Okay, so Matthew sees this as the fulfillment of a prophecy, that the Christ, apparently Jesus, would be called a Nazarene, someone from the town of Nazareth. All right? There's a problem here. Because he says it was, yes. There's a problem here because, she's missing the best part. Because he says it's from the prophets, and you can read the whole Old Testament and you will not find one verse of Scripture where it says anywhere, even hints, not even a little bit, that someone will be a Nazarene. There's nowhere it says he will be called a Nazarene, or any reference to in fact, Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. And you might say, well, but aren't there other books outside of that didn't make it into the Bible? Oh yeah, we have plenty of books. We still have not found one reference to this prophecy that Matthew is aware of. And he's quoting as a prophecy inspired by God. So we have no idea what he's quoting from. And this is not the only place. Matthew quotes another scripture later on that he says, I think is from Jeremiah, which is not found in Jeremiah at all. So apparently there were other writings floating around, at least that Matthew knew about, that we don't have anymore. But the Jews already had sacred writings, okay? Just because they weren't settled didn't mean they didn't have something. They had the Torah, as I showed you. They have the Torah. They had some of the prophets, probably, and some of the writings. They also had other writings that were later rejected by the Jews. But But they did have writings that they believed contained God's revelation to them. And Jesus and the apostles accepted these. They were Jews. So they already accepted the Jewish scriptures as God's inspired word and revelation. They didn't reject them. They took them for granted. Remember when we read 2 Timothy, yes? 2 Timothy. And Paul is writing about the Old Testament when he talks to Timothy. You've known the scriptures from your youth, from your infancy, I should say. He's talking about the Old Testament. There was one major difference. The Jewish scriptures were now read and interpreted by Christians through the prism of Jesus. His teaching, his life, his ministry, and especially his dying on the cross and his rising to life. So that's the difference. Jesus, when he takes the scriptures, he interprets them in connection to him, to his views, and his followers do the same. Especially when Jesus is killed and crucified and he rises, they believe he rises from the dead. That's how they start reading the Jewish scriptures as prophecy of all of this, foretelling Jesus. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of God's revelation to Israel. So when we talk about encountering sacred writings, how do you encounter God in these sacred writings of the Jews, which don't talk about Jesus? You encounter them, you look for Jesus. You look for Jesus, like Matthew looks for predictions of where Jesus was going to grow up in Nazareth, stuff like that. They encounter Jesus in every book of the Jewish scriptures now. That's how they have meaning for them. Okay. Just do back and forth. Okay, so moving on to this. As I told you, the canon was not settled. They had writings. Some of them were clear, like the Torah. They were written in Hebrew. Okay, Hebrew. Which was, at the time of Jesus, pretty much a dead language. It was used in the synagogue and the worship services, but except for maybe the rabbis and the singers, most people didn't understand it anymore. It was a dead language. In fact, they had interpreters who would, in the local language Aramaic, would, after the reading was read in Hebrew, they would stand up and they would interpret in Aramaic what it meant for the people, because no one knew. So you had these writings in Hebrew, and most Jews at the time also did not live in Israel. Most Jews were spread out across the Mediterranean, and they also didn't read Hebrew. But they did read Greek if they were educated, because Greek was the language of education across the Mediterranean world. So at a certain period of time, a couple hundred years before Jesus, like around the 200s BC, so the story goes. I mean, it's a story. We don't know how historically reliable it is, but we know something happened because this document exists, called the Septuagint. You have a bunch of, according to the story, I'll tell you the story, the legend, which is that a ruler in Egypt wanted copies of all the sacred writings of the various religions of the world. And he found out in his library that he didn't have a copy, God bless you, Miss America, he didn't have a copy of the Jewish sacred writings. So he wanted one. So what did he do? He got a bunch of rabbis, okay? He got a bunch of scribes. Maybe there are scribes. And he brought them to Egypt, and they all, they locked them away individually. They were not together as a group. They were each individuals. And they took the Hebrew scriptures, and they were charged with translating them into Greek for this Egyptian ruler. Okay, and there were 70 of them. That's the number that's given. And these 70 scribes did it, okay? And in a certain amount of time, they came up with, each with his own translation of the complete Jewish scriptures. Well, complete. Scholars debate from this story whether they gave the complete Tanakh, or whether they just were supposed to translate the Torah. It's not exactly clear from the story. But anyways, we'll just go with, let us say, the Bible for sake of a lack of it. And they translate the Bible from Hebrew, from their native Hebrew, into Greek. And miracle of miracles, not only do they do it pretty quickly, but when they look at these 70 versions of all these 70 scribes, they're all in perfect agreement. You know, it's a Festivus miracle. You know? They're all exactly, each one is exactly the same as the other. So it's seen as a miracle. That's according to the story. Okay, so remember, it was 70 scribes, yes? 70? Hence, this work is called into Greek, this translation into Greek of the Hebrew Scriptures is called the Septuagint. Septuaginta in Latin means 70. I don't know if anyone speaks Spanish in the class, but you know this word setenta. Setenta in Spanish. Septuaginta. Setenta. Septante, if you took French in high school. Okay? 70, or as it's abbreviated, I didn't put this on the PowerPoint, it's abbreviated in Latin, L, which you NFL fans should know means 50. Super Bowl 50. They love using the Roman numerals in the NFL. 50, and this is how you count in Latin numbers. So 50, and then 10 more is 60, and then 10 more is 70. All right, so the LXX, or the Septuagint, the 70. I shouldn't have done that, that's confusing. Right. The Septuagint, or the LXX.
With 4 be 4 eyes, or would it actually?
What I?
What a 4? I wanted to write 4 in Roman numeral.
How do you write 4? Would be IV.
Oh.
Yeah, I before V. So a 1 before 5. V is 5. Because the Roman numerals are not numbers, they're letters. They're letters. In most ancient languages, letters are numbers. Okay, so an I is 1, a V is 5, an X is 10, an L is 50. Huh?
Said L is 50.
Yeah, L is 50. C is 100, has a value of 100. D is 500, it's a value of 500. M is a value of 1,000. We'll get into this later when we talk about the Apocalypse of John, because Hebrew does the same thing. Hebrew letters have numerical value. And by adding up those letters, you get like the number of the beast, 666. And that's how we know probably who they were referring to. But anyways. So yeah, the Septuagint with this translation. Now the interesting thing about this translation is that it includes a whole bunch of extra books as scripture, as part of the Jewish Tanakh, that Jews would later not accept. And this, okay, yeah, later. Oh, I didn't mention that. I gave him the story, but it doesn't matter. It has extra books. This version of scripture, the Septuagint, the 70, this was the version of the Old Testament that Christians took over. This is what they accepted. They were all Jews, okay? So, and a lot of them were Jews outside of Palestine. So that's the version of the Bible they were reading. They couldn't read Hebrew, okay? No more. Not even in Palestine could they read Hebrew. But they were reading this Greek version of their scriptures that had extra books in it, called the Deuterocanon, the later called the Deuterocanon in the Middle Ages. The second canon, deuteros means second. So the second authoritative list, that were not accepted later into the Jewish canon. We don't know exactly why. There are various theories. We just don't know why. Some of them, the argument was, well, they weren't written in Hebrew, except we know now that some of them were written in Hebrew originally. The argument also was that after a certain period of time, prophecy ended in Israel. So any book written after that period of time, like around the 400s BC, would not be accepted as scripture because there was no more prophecy. Well, the problem with that is that we know books like Daniel, which the Jews do accept, were written pretty late, like in the 200s, maybe into the 100s BC. So it's not sure. They don't really tell us why. Okay? So we have these books that are called deuterocanonical. Okay? It's a general name given to several books of the Old Testament that their authority has sometimes been questioned. Certainly it was questioned by the Jews. The Jews didn't accept them. The Christian church pretty much did up until around the 1500s when Protestantism arose. But for the most part, they were unquestioned. And these are them. Tobit, Judith, Esther, with additions, Greek Esther, which has a longer version of Esther, the first book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, or the Book of Wisdom, the Wisdom of Sirach, the Book of Baruch, and the Book of Daniel, with additions. There are additions on the end of Daniel. So it's longer. With Baruch, there's actually, chapter 6 of Baruch is actually a separate book. It surely should be placed as a separate book, but they don't. They usually put it as chapter 6 of the book of Baruch. It's called the Letter of Jeremiah. Oops. There you go. Which, as the name suggests, purports to be a letter from the prophet Jeremiah. There are also other books. These were the books that generally came to be accepted. There were some other books that were part of the Septuagint that were even questionable by Christians, although some, like Eastern Orthodox Christians, do still accept them. Eastern Orthodox Christians, or Eastern Catholic Christians, or Eastern Orthodox Christians, I should say, they accept the Septuagint as their only translation of the Old Testament. They don't accept the Hebrew. So they accept certain other books. So there's the third book of Maccabees. There's also an additional psalm. There are 150 psalms, but they add Psalm 151. There's also a thing called the Prayer of Manasseh, one of the kings of Israel. I feel like I'm missing another book that the Eastern Orthodox would accept. Well, whatever. Anyways. But this is generally fine. This is certainly what the Catholic Church accepts, and I'm Catholic, so I'm going with that. Even though I'm Eastern Catholic, but I'm going with that. Woo-hoo for the Pope. Yes, Ms. Jacoby. Eastern Catholic and like Western Catholic, like Roman Catholic, there's really not much of a difference. We're all under the Pope, but about 1,000 years into the history of Christianity, and if you take world religions with me in the spring, I'll mention this. Hint, hint. Anyways, but I don't know, maybe you've taken other general education courses, but whatever. You could always do a minor in religious studies. About 1,000 years into the history of Christianity, there was a split between Eastern and Western Christianity. A lot of it was cultural. They spoke different languages. The West spoke Latin, the East spoke Greek. A lot of it was also it had to do with their customs. They worshiped differently, but they had pretty much the same beliefs. There was a question about the papacy. The Easterners did not like the Pope being so strong and powerful, okay? And the popes were always trying to assert their authority over the Eastern Christians who were resistant. And so it eventually came to a head, and they just decided to break relations with the Pope. And after that, other things developed, and there were claims that, one side was teaching wrong things, and, so other stuff crops up. But for the most part, it was like a lot of politics and a lot of cultural things that kind of finally came to a head. But the papacy was a big one. The authority of the Pope over the whole church, that was a big one. But for Eastern Catholics are really Eastern Orthodox that came back into communion with the Pope of Rome, usually in the Middle Ages, like the 1500s or the 1700s, which is the modern period. And they came back into communion with the church. So we're kind of like, you could say we're Eastern Orthodox in communion with Rome. But our beliefs are basically the same. Worship is very different. Our way of doing theology is kind of different. But no, we're no real difference in belief. Okie dokie. So the Deuterocanon. What want to tell you? The Septuagint. Okay. What are these books about? I mean, just to give you just a quick rundown of what's in these books, like Tobit and Judith. The NAP wants to call them novellas, but they're not. Are just stories that are being told. Tobit's a man who, is suffering, and he sends his son to some bank far away to get money. And along the way, the son also, meets a woman and gets married. So there's kind of that little love story going on. Okay, but it's trying to show faithfulness to God and trusting God. Judith is a woman who saves the Jews from their enemies by cutting off the head of the general of an army that's attacking the Jews. And so that's the whole story about that. Esther is a similar story with a woman who saves the Jews from annihilation. First and Second Maccabees are really histories that are about the Jewish rebellion which occurred in the 2nd century BC, where a group of Jews rebelled against foreign power and actually reestablished some independence for the Jews for a brief period until they were crushed by the Romans. Anyways, so it tells the history of that. The Book of Wisdom is wisdom literature. It's talking about wisdom and the right way to live your life. Sirach is also wisdom literature. It's a long book. It has a lot of all sorts of different, and talks about everything. But again, how to live your life in accordance with God's will. Baruch is a prophet. He was a scribe of the prophet Jeremiah. And this book is... Are you okay? You all right?
Me?
Yeah. Oh, I thought you said something. Okay. And he gets his own book of prophecy, which includes the letter of Jeremiah. And then the book of Daniel, which has some additional stories added on to it. Okay? Interestingly enough, most citations from the New Testament, about 2/3, so that's about like over 60% of the citations of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, are from the Septuagint translation. So we know that the apostles and the early Christians were using it. They were not using the Hebrew originals. So that's what they accepted apparently as their scriptures. And many, if not most, early Christian authors also use the Septuagint. Okay? And there might be possibly citations, or there certainly are allusions to the deuterocanonical books in the New Testament. So, they knew about them. So what happened? How did the Jew, or at least the Jews, these books were written by Jews. Some of them were written in Hebrew, like Tobit was written in Aramaic. Judith and First Maccabees were almost certainly written in Hebrew. Sirach as well. We found Hebrew Sirach. Baruch, parts of it in Hebrew. The Book of Wisdom was only written in Greek. That we know that. No Hebrew original for wisdom. So, how did they fall out of favor with the Jews? Or who made the decision? Well, as I said, we don't really know. Apparently, from what we can understand, the Jews, had certainly privileged the Hebrew text over anything else. But they also wanted to fit the number of books for the Tanakh within the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So there were 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So you had to fit 22 books in, okay? Which you still really can't do. That's why the minor prophets are considered one book. So they make sure that, all these 12 separate books are just considered one book, and you have the 5 scrolls, so 5 scrolls can be considered one. So that's how they kind of compress it. And I just think that these books didn't fit, they just didn't fit in to their scheme, okay, and so they fell out. But they were used by the early Christian church. Nevertheless, development has to take place, okay? Development has to take place, even amongst Christians, all right? We know that, we found some of these books, like Sirach. As I told you, we found in Hebrew, we found parchments of Sirach at archaeological digs of Jewish communities, portions of the letter of Jeremiah in Greek, not in Hebrew, but in Greek, were found amongst Jewish communities from this time, Aramaic and Hebrew manuscripts of Tobit, and stuff like that. So we knew that these things were circulating amongst Jewish communities and being read, not just in Greek Septuagint, but also in their original languages. But what was going on in Christianity? Well, Christianity eventually had to make its decision. And really the Jews had to make their decision because of Christianity, okay? Because Christians were citing the Septuagint to try and prove Jesus was the Messiah. And so Jews had to kind of figure out for themselves, well, what sacred writings do we actually accept? But Christians as well, they kind of knew what they believed for the most part, but there were still some questions among some Christians. Some, after the Jews decided on the shorter list, there were some Christians like in the East who said, well, we should really follow what the Jews are doing. So get rid of these other books. They're good books, but just, they're not scripture. So Tobit, Judith, etc., and so forth. Since the Jews don't accept them, the Jews should know, so we should just follow the Jews. Well, okay, fine, but Jesus and the apostles were Jews too. And they accepted the Septuagint apparently. And they accepted one would assume they accepted these other books that were in the Septuagint. It's not like they would just read the books that that were accepted by the Jews and when Jesus came to First Maccabees, he's like, okay, skip over this. They were there. Our first indication of a question about the canon and what to accept comes from the Council of Rome, which was held in 382, under Pope St. Damasus. Now, not everyone agreed. As I put up there, the longer canon was favored in the Western Church, but not by everybody. You had heavy hitters like this man called St. Jerome, who's the patron saint of biblical scholarship because he did so much translation of the Bible. And Hilary of Poitiers, who's another saint and church father. They actually favored the shorter canon of the East because they thought the Jews knew what was right. And St. Jerome, when he did his Bible translation, he was asked by the Pope to do them, and he didn't want to translate Judith or Tobit. He hesitated. He was hesitant. The Pope actually had to force him to do it. And he complained about it, but he did it, even though he probably didn't think they were scriptural. But at the Council of Rome in 382, under Pope St. Damasus, it defined these books. It specified, okay, these are the books we accept, and these extra books are included. The Deuterocanon are certainly accepted by the Church of Rome. This idea, this was followed and defended by a man named St. Augustine of Hippo, who was an African bishop. Okay. Northern Africa, here in Algeria. Modern day Algeria is where Hippo, the city of Hippo was. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, this is Hippo. Down here. No, I'm pretty sure this is Hippo in Algeria. Excuse me, where St. Augustine was from. He was bishop. That can't be right. And he was supportive and was a major defender of this tradition of the Septuagint with its longer canon against people like Jerome and Hilary. And it doesn't mean they were enemies, they were friends. We have letters between Jerome and Augustine, they respected each other, but they certainly disagreed on the length of the canon. They disagreed with each other. And there were a couple of major councils that Augustine held in northern Africa to kind of solidify the position. The Council of Hippo in 393, and then councils of Carthage, two in Carthage, the city of Carthage, which is actually in Tunisia, it's not in Algeria right now, and 397 and 419. Okay. And if you're interested, just for your own knowledge, he talks about the canon and states his views in this section of De Doctrina Christiana on Christian doctrine, this work that he was writing in 397 AD. And if you wanted to see what he says, it's in book 2. Because, of course, he's talking about Christian teaching. So, you have to talk about where are the sources of Christian teaching. You have to define your sources. So he feels the need to define the canon of Scripture. And he follows the canon from the Council of Rome. This canon was affirmed by Pope St. Innocent I later on, who was Pope in the early 400s, even 401 to 417, in a letter he wrote to a bishop who was asking questions of him. And one of the questions that came up is, all right, could you tell us which books, because they knew there was a question. There were some people who were not sure about some of the books. Which books should we have in our Bible, This letter, Consulenti TV, he died in 417. It was written to a bishop, Exuperius, who was a bishop in Gaul, ancient France. ancient France, ex superius, consulenti tibi. His letter to ex superius, this bishop in Gaul, or ancient France. Okay, 405 AD. And he confirms the decision of he expresses the decision, I should say, he confirms the Council of Rome. But, well, he does confirm the decision. He confirms the decision of the Council of Rome and passes that on to this Bishop ex superius, saying, yes, these are the books you should accept. These are the sacred writings we accept in the Church of Rome. And that becomes the standard for Christianity for the next, 1,100 years. Okay, the last thing I just want to show you before I'll move on is this, just from one of the ancient codices, which comes from the 300s of our codices of the Septuagint. And here's the first book of Maccabees. So you can see, here it is. I'm not lying to you, okay? There's the first book of Maccabees. And it's one of our earliest complete Bibles that we have for Christianity. Old Testament and New Testament. So I'll come back to the rest of this on Thursday. So that's it for today. God bless you all. I will see you on Thursday. Remember, the quiz is due Friday. Or forget.